The ballroom of the Belmont Hotel was filled almost to capacity. Tables draped with snow-white linen, centerpieces decorated with flowers and elegant silver and china sets. There were already more than 200 guests. Men in dark blue or gray suits with gold cufflinks, shiny black shoes and silk ties, and women in expensive dresses with sequins and bows, with slits exposing just the right amount of leg or cleavage to outshine their rival, whoever she might be. The guests, many of whom were already in various stages of intoxication, crowded around, joining in numerous small groups to talk and laugh, sipping drinks, pointing out new guests, and greeting them as they entered the ballroom. The ballroom was hung with banners announcing and celebrating the annual spring banquet of Prairieland Securities, a moderately large and relatively successful financial services firm that had had a very successful year. It was expected that almost all the salaried employees in the main office would attend the banquet, eating and drinking, socializing and celebrating, and listening to a few speeches about how well things were going at the company and how grateful they should be to work for such a dynamic firm. 15 or so minutes before the dinner began, as the guests were just beginning to take their places at the tables, there was a slight buzz of excitement in the room when Frank Portis entered. Frank was widely recognized as the brightest and most aggressive of the Young Turks, a man who would probably be announced as the youngest head of the unit in the next few months. He was tall and muscular, with an olive complexion, short dark hair, and sharp, well-defined features, handsome by almost any standard. But the attention he attracted had more to do with who he came with. With him was Jolene Matthews, a woman who could not be described as stunning. Rich copper red hair that fell in long locks down to halfway down her back. She wore a midnight black dress. Everything about her appearance demanded attention, and as if on cue, men and women stopped abruptly to admire her beauty as she and Frank stopped briefly at the entrance before they plunged into the heart of the ballroom. Somewhere near the grandstand, a huge male bear with long, dark brown hair and a wild, bushy beard waved a hand at Frank, catching his attention. Frank turned to Jolene and pointed at the bear. "Hey, this is Paul. Why don't you go that way and I'll get something to drink? White wine will do?" Jolene nodded, flashed a fluorescent smile, and headed toward the ballroom entrance, while Frank headed toward the bar, navigating an upscale obstacle course of tables, waiters, and guests. As he approached the bar, his progress was impeded by a mass of slow-moving people waiting and jostling in a poorly organized line. Frustrated by the lack of movement, Frank let his thoughts wander, mentally separating himself from the crowd with daydreams of victories at work and on the golf course, and thoughts of Jolene. The line had no sooner advanced more than a few feet than his self-distraction was interrupted by the vague sensation of hearing his name called. When he heard it a second time, he turned and was surprised to see the smiling face of his best high school friend, 11 years since graduation and 2 years since they had last met. Bobby Mullins was easy to remember. Gorgeous white horse teeth gleaming beneath a mustache, laughing eyes prematurely crinkled at the edges from smiles and sunshine, and black hair oiled and slicked back. He was dressed in a dark blue suit, maroon tie, and silk shirt, and looked as slick as anyone else in the room. But his speech and mannerisms were those of a country boy from southern Illinois, raised among soybean and cornfields rather than concrete and asphalt. "Bobby? I'll be damned, it's good to see you. What are you doing in town?" Frank reached for Bobby's left shoulder and pulled him closer, shaking his right hand. "I just got here. Came to Frankie's party." "Wait, you came all the way from St. Louis for a party? That's a long way, even for you to get free food and booze." Frank laughed and shook his head, letting go of Bobby's hand. "Hey, I've got a point. Just because no one expects the dudes from the St. Louis office to show up doesn't mean we won't. I figured you Chicagoans have stayed away from us all these years, so I thought I'd see what I was missing." They made small talk for a few more minutes until the line finally moved, and they both took a couple steps forward. Frank continued the conversation. "So, Bobby, how are things going outside of work? Are you still seeing a new girl every month?" "I don't know. It's hard to keep track, but I guess on average I do." Bobby grinned mischievously. "Sooner or later I'll grow up and settle down, but not anytime soon." Bobby and Frank chuckled, And then, after hesitating a bit, Bobby asked quietly, "So, how's life treating you, Frank? Everything okay?" Frank paused, making it clear that he didn't have a simple or easy answer to that question. He pressed his lips together tightly and ran a hand through his hair before he began to answer. "Well, everything's kind of okay. Right now. I don't know if you heard or not, but Becky and I, well, we're not together right now." Bobby frowned but showed no real surprise. I, uh, I heard. I'm sorry, Frank. Tough case." "Yeah, it is." There was an awkward silence for a moment before Frank awkwardly broke it by asking who Bobby had brought to the gala. "Oh, I came as a stag, Frankie, but I hope I don't leave like this." Bobby's eyes sparkled as he said this, and when he finished, smacked his lips and raised his eyebrows defiantly. "Typical," Frank said, shaking his head. "Some things never change." They stood in the front rows, and Frank ordered 2 white wines and Bobby ordered a beer. Frank gestured toward the bleachers and Jolene. "Hey, Bobby, I'm with someone tonight, but why don't you eat with us? Naturally, it's off limits, but maybe someone else will sit at the table." "Oh, I wouldn't interfere with your actions, Frankie, but yes, I'd love to eat with you. Show me the way." Bobby picked up the bottle of beer and tipped it over in a mocking toast. "Happy anniversary, kiddo." Becky smiled across the table at Frank, her light brown hair and soft curls spreading over her shoulders and framing a face with fine, childlike features that might have been called pretty if it weren't for a weak chin and too many freckles. She wore an elegant black dress, her left hand unconsciously fumbling with the string of pearls around her neck, a gift she had just received from Frank, while her right hand raised her champagne glass in toast. Frank raised his glass and smiled, admiring his wife. "Here's to us. Forever." They clinked glasses and sipped bubbling pale yellow champagne, while the setting August sun cast streaks of pink and orange through the window and onto the white tablecloth. "It's a lovely restaurant, a lovely evening, Frank. Thank you so much for everything. For the pearls and for everything. It's the least I can do for my wife, the woman I love, for someone as beautiful as you." He nodded appraisingly toward her body. "I love the way you look in that dress. You should wear it more often." She blushed and giggled. "It's a special dress for special occasions. I wouldn't want to dilute the magic it has, or the enchantments cast on you might weaken." "Well, the dress certainly helps, but the spell is mostly cast by what's underneath." Frank gave her a lecherous grin. The waiter came over and ostentatiously arranged the salads on the table, then took great pleasure in sprinkling pepper on each one before filling their glasses with champagne and leaving, mumbling some congratulations on their anniversary. Frank took a bite and, chewing slowly, regarded Becky's right forearm with some curiosity. After swallowing, he gestured at it with his empty fork. "What's that on your arm? Is that a rash?" "Yeah, I think it's just poison ivy. I think I picked it up at the Netsall picnic when I was walking around the pond." "Oh yeah, I lost sight of you for a while. You know, it's a very pretty park and I like that pond." "Yes, that's what I thought. I guess you were canoeing for a couple hours." Becky frowned slightly and aggressively pounced on a piece of lettuce. "Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I'd like to do it again." Becky pursed her lips in thought, then looked at Frank with sudden seriousness and purred. "You know I love you, don't you, Frank? That you're the only man for me?" The unexpected decisiveness of Becky's statement caught Frank off guard and puzzled him slightly. He tilted his head and furrowed his brow in response, stared at Becky for a moment, then replied softly, "Yes, and I love you." He leaned across the table so that his face was less than a foot away from Becky's and continued, "But our relationship is more than love. We're comfortable with each other. We like each other. And we need each other." He gently touched the side of her face. "And we have trust. No matter what, after all this time getting to know each other, we both absolutely trust each other." Becky's smile trembled slightly when he said that, and she lowered her gaze to her salad, awkwardly breaking away from his gaze. When Frank arrived with the wine, Jolene smiled and kissed his cheek, whispering thanks before taking a sip. Frank, accompanied by Bobby, found her in a group with Paul and half a dozen other people listening with obvious boredom to a short, slightly overweight woman with unnaturally blonde hair and one extra chin describing with tedious detail the various events and places she and her husband had encountered during their recent vacation in Europe. Her husband, a heavyset vice president named Duncan, was as bored as the rest of them and took the opportunity to loudly greet Frank and gustily shake his hand, effectively interrupting his wife's monologue. While she eagerly took center stage again, all the potential listeners followed Duncan's lead, greeting and introducing each other to Frank and Bobby, who blended into the circle of strangers like old friends. Paul Jensen, a huge bear of a man, introduced himself and his companion, a petite woman with black hair and a pretty face named Angie Simmons, as Frank's friends and co-workers. Bobby immediately made Paul laugh with an ambiguous line about being jealous of his size and made Angie blush with pleasure when he commented that he now understood the saying that good things come in small packages. When Bobby was introduced to Jolene, he raised his eyebrows and exhaled a low whistle through compressed lips, causing more laughter when he turned to Frank and said, "Looks like the Little Mermaid has grown very well. Great catch, Frankie, great catch." The other two in the group were an older couple who, if he carried a pitchfork and she wore her hair in a bundle, could have been taken straight out of American Gothic. They were not easily charmed, and they took the greetings humorlessly, engaging in minimal interaction so as not to appear rude, and then slipped away quietly, in one move avoiding conversation with the younger couples with whom they had little in common, and avoiding additional travel stories from Duncan's plump blonde wife. Ignoring their departure, Bobby continued to enthusiastically swap stories of getting to know each other, enthralling everyone except Duncan's wife, who seemed more than annoyed when it became clear that no one in the group wanted to hear any more about her European exploits. Finally, with poorly concealed irritation, Mrs. Doublechin announced that she was going to find a table with the other vice presidents and their wives. She left ahead of Duncan, who lingered long enough to quietly say, "Well, hell, now I'm going to have to listen to all this again. I'm sorry I've been such a bitch lately." Frank had just gotten home, and Becky was sitting in a padded chair by the front door, smiling at him tokenistically, crossing her legs, putting her hands on both arms of the chair, and arranging her hair on top of her head. She was wearing spectacular makeup. Frank hesitated for a moment before raising his eyebrows, and finally responded with an exaggerated chuckle. "Well, either you wore a very naughty Halloween costume, or I'm about to get lucky." "Halloween was last week, babe, so I think it's fair to say I wore it for luck." She laughed softly. Frank hung his coat on the coat rack, keeping his eyes on her. "I take it that after playing nun for a few weeks, you're suddenly interested in something." Becky pouted slightly and rose from her chair, placing her hands loosely on Frank's shoulders. "I'm sorry about that. Like I said, I was a bitch. I have every intention of making it up to you right now, and in the most sincere way possible. So you think that after completely abandoning me under various lame excuses, you'll be able to get me back into bed?" She pulled back to examine his face and found him smiling, but his eyebrows raised in anticipation of an answer. "Yes, Mr. Portis, yes you are." She said it in a syrupy sweet tone of mock innocence. "And you thought I'd forget all these rejections and your feeble excuses and just jump into bed? You think I'm that easy?" "Well, you're a man. Doesn't that make you easy by definition?" He laughed incredulously and shook his head. "Honestly, you've been changing your temperature so often lately that sometimes you just confuse me. I'm a woman, so part of my job is to mystify you." She smiled, winked at him, and led him to the bedroom with a sultry gait. 30 minutes later, when he opened his eyes, he saw that she was just lying there, and her face was frozen with an expression he had no way of defining. Disappointment? Boredom? Distraction? Something else? She turned away without a word, curling up in a ball and turning her back to him. Frank reached out and touched her shoulder. "What happened? You totally screwed me over at the end." "I'm sorry. I guess I was tired." Her voice was hollow, soulless. "Tired? Bullshit, Becky. I think you've just lost interest. Am I boring you? You came. Why are you complaining? She asked with a sharp, contrived calm. Stunned by her behavior, he stared incredulously at her back for a few moments before answering. I don't know what the hell is going on, Becky, but things have to change, and it has to change fast. Becky let his words hang in the air for a few moments, then replied softly, Yes, yes, it has to. The group had just had time to take a table when the dressed-up waiters began bringing out plates of salmon, beef, and chicken, practically throwing the dishes on the table in a desperate attempt to serve the full room of guests more or less simultaneously. As the waiters pounced on their table, the resulting noise and chaos from clinking plates, flying hands, and rapid-fire questions about food choices turned the conversation into something of a challenge. So, Paul, Bobby half-shouted, nodding with a smile to the sweating young man who had just placed a plate of chicken in front of him. How long have you worked at Prairie? Paul pursed his lips and thought for a moment, looking up at the ceiling. Probably about 12 years. I joined right out of college. Started out in the research department, but about 5 years ago, I was transferred to the small client department, about the same time Frank started. We've been together ever since. Things are going well? Yeah, I'd say so. Management seems happy. Paul nodded casually toward Frank. They seem to think our guy walks on water. Bobby opened his eyes in mock surprise. Wait, what? He can't actually walk on water? I always thought he did. Jolene nodded to the waiter who placed a plate of salmon in front of her, then looked at Bobby and smirked. Maybe he's changed since you've known him. Well, it's hard to imagine he's gotten any more gorgeous. At school, he was always Mr. Wonderful, top of the class, the best athlete, the most popular, the most successful. And I stuck around to bask in his glory and try to pick up scraps from his table. Frank, laughing, challenged Bobby. Maybe you're exaggerating a little? If I remember correctly, you were quite the athlete yourself. And those girls you spent time with weren't exactly table scraps. One of them was a homecoming queen, and another, if I remember correctly, was a contestant in the Miss Illinois pageant. Ah, never mind, Frank. Bobby waved his hand dismissively but playfully in the direction of his old friend. The results speak for themselves. One of us went to Northwestern University on a full soccer scholarship and then finished the MBA program at C University, and the other went to Eastern Illinois and barely graduated. Wait, you played soccer at Northwestern? Interjected Angie sharply, tilting her head to the side curiously. I didn't know that. Oh, well, I didn't really play, at least not very much. Frank smiled embarrassedly. I sat on the bench for 4 years. I think I played maybe 30 games in garbage time. But hey, it helped pay for college, so it worked out. Bobby looked at Angie, gesturing to Frank for a piece of bread. Frank was always recognizable. He was the guy who practiced between games. He was also the only guy who never went to frat parties or broke team rules. Unfun Frank, I think that's what they called him. Or maybe that nickname was made up by me. Bobby winked at Frank and laughed. And seriously, are you still Mr. Serious? Or do you do anything at all for fun these days? Mostly I'm working on plans to improve the profitability of the Prairie, which of course is a lot of fun. Frank joked, eliciting a deep, fog-horn-like laugh from Paul and a few quiet chuckles from the women. No, really, I still only read or play on the computer, and Paul and I play hopscotch and golf and sometimes go to the gym. Frank paused and pointed a finger playfully accusingly at Bobby. But you don't know about that, since you spend all your time partying and going to bars. Maybe someday I'll grow up and be as boring as you. Bobby smiled broadly, defiantly raising his bottle to take a swig of beer. But honestly, I can't understand why I feel like skipping parties and giving up drinking. Don't you think you've had enough to drink? The Christmas party at Prairieland Securities was winding down, and Frank and Becky were sitting at a table with Jolene, Paul, and a cute little clerk from accounting. All three of them averted their eyes with slight embarrassment at Frank's irritated and angry challenge. They knew it was coming. It had been simmering for almost an hour as she flirted and made suggestive comments to almost everyone who came by the table, and her flirting was getting worse as the evening went on and the amount of alcohol consumed. Becky stopped midway through, carefully placed her cocktail on the table, and stared with obvious irritation at Frank, who made no attempt to hide his annoyance. "I'm not driving, who cares?" she hissed defiantly. She spat out defiantly. Said, "You don't have to drive to cause trouble over a drink." Trouble? What kind of problems? Behavior problems, Becky. You don't like my behavior? I thought I was being friendly. Weren't you always complaining about how, quiet I was? The clerk was fidgeting with the increasing discomfort caused by the hostile exchange, and now, unable to bear it any longer, silently stood up and apologized with a slight nod and moved away from the table as quickly as possible. Jolene and Paul felt equally uncomfortable, but tried to pretend not to care about the heated argument at the other end of the table. But in the face of the rising tension, they were unable to do so. Sensing their unease, Frank lowered his voice to an angry hiss to get his point across. Friendliness is good, Becky, but you went overboard today. The way you dragged men out on the dance floor and flirted with the jokes and innuendos you subjected all of us to. It's ridiculous. My God, you embarrassed Bob Thomas and Steve Ananias in front of their wives so badly with that mistletoe face kiss that I thought they were going to leave the party early. Come on, you're drunk, and everyone knows it, and it's causing problems. You're humiliating me, and tomorrow you'll be embarrassed when. Or if, you remember what you did tonight. Embarrassed? Am I embarrassing you? Are you embarrassed of your wife? Becky's voice became loud and defiant. Keep it down, Becky. Hell, people are watching. I'm sorry. I don't want to embarrass you any more than... Jolene couldn't take it anymore, and in a soft, even parental voice interrupted. You're not yourself right now, Becky. Let me take you to the executive lounge, and you can take a nap. Becky turned to Jolene with fire in her eyes. I don't remember talking to you or asking your opinion. It's not your problem, so why don't you leave, okay, Ginger? Stung, Jolene inhaled sharply as if she'd been punched. Look, Becky, I didn't mean to... Becky brushed aside what she was about to say with a wave of her hand. It's okay, Jolene. I'm sorry if my husband objects to me trying to get attention, but I guess I didn't expect someone like you to realize that people like me have to put in a little effort. I mean, you walk into a room like this with thick red hair and a perfect face, and men fall at your feet, and we mere mortals have to do a little more than bitches like you to... Becky was suddenly silent as Frank grabbed her arm. He pulled her to him and then whispered roughly in her ear. Stand up. I'll walk you out of here right now. She jumped to her feet as Frank lifted her up and, half stumbling, half following him, led her out of the room, pushing her roughly against the wall in the outer hallway. I've had enough of you and your behavior, Becky. I've had enough of you. It's one thing to be cold, reserved, and sullen at home, but this kind of public behavior, that's crossing the line. Do you understand? She nodded weakly. Frank, Shut up and listen to Becky, because I'm tired of this shit. Frank unhinged his jaw and took a few deep breaths before starting again. If you ever, under any circumstances, speak to my friend or coworker like that again, I will explode. Understood? Becky nodded. And, in particular, if you ever speak to Jolene like that again, well, you just better not, because I'll be incredibly angry, and I don't know what I can do. Actually, in fact, I don't want you to talk to Jolene at all, under any circumstances, ever. Okay? Never again. So if I hear that you talked to her or yelled at her, if she tells me that she got a nasty phone call from you, or a snide remark at an event, or anything at all that upsets her, I'm going to freak out, and won't like the result. Got it? A tear ran down Becky's cheek, but she refused to answer, only nodded dazedly. Come on, I'll take you home and put you to bed. Tell me about it, Bobby asked Jolene as she continued to chew a rather rubbery piece of desiccated chicken. What do you do on the prairie? Jolene furrowed her brow slightly. I work for a company called Net Solutions. Okay, I get it, but you're mostly at Prairie, right? Oh yeah, that's right. I probably spend a lot more time there than I do at NetSol. I'm working on a web product, helping create a personal investment webpage for Prairie. They? She pointed to Frank and Paul. Tell me what features their clients need, and I help implement them on the page. Mostly, they try to make it easier for small individual investors to trade their accounts. Bobby finally swallowed, took a big gulp of beer with his bite, and looked at Jolene again. And how long have you been doing this? Making Prairie more friendly to small investors? He asked, bringing another bite to his mouth. Oh, God. She tilted her head and rolled her eyes to the left, thinking for a moment. A little over a year, I think. Is that right, Frank? About a year? Frank nodded. Yeah, about that. We started working together on the initial stuff last March, but really stepped up at the beginning of the summer. So you're a programmer? Asked Bobby, chewing. Not exactly. I have a degree in graphic design. I mostly create layouts, try to make the page user-friendly. I write some code, but all the hard stuff is written by the programmer guys at NetSol. Bobby finished another bite, wiped his mouth with his napkin, and then tilted his head, scrutinizing Jolene with appreciation and curiosity. You know, I swear I've met you somewhere before, but I can't remember where exactly. Which is unusual for me, because my memory never fails when I recall time spent with a beautiful girl. Frank snorted at his remark, and Bobby's face spread into a huge grin. Jolene shrugged and held her hands palms up. I don't know where we could have met. I never worked in an office in Peoria. I got my degree at Loyola. I'm sure I know, offered Angie, chuckling. I bet a lot of guys think they know her. Jolene is the girl from the NetSol commercials. Bobby leaned back in his chair. Huh? You know, the commercial where some nerd gets upset because his business is failing. And then a hot red-headed girl comes in and fixes his webpage, and the guy gets rid of his glasses and turns into a super happy, successful businessman. Bobby's eyes went wide in recognition. Right. I knew I'd seen you. Hell, I almost wanted to start a failing business just to see if I could get you to come in and fix things. Everyone at the table groaned and laughed. Bobby smirked and continued. So how did you get into advertising? Well, I was helping out in advertising at the time, and they brought me in to do a commercial. They were auditioning actresses, and the director saw me. Well, one thing led to another, and I ended up getting the part. You must have done some modeling or something too, I mean. Jolene raised her hands in protest, interrupting Bobby. Oh, I'm too curvy to be a model. Bobby snorted. Where I come from, there's no such thing as a too curvy woman. It's hard to believe you haven't at least tried it. Honestly, I've never really thought about it. The NetSol commercials were the only thing I did. I guess I didn't want to get so caught up in trying to model or anything like that I'd lose sight of my career in graphics and end up on the margins of life. Where the hell have you been? It's almost midnight. Becky stood in the entryway with her hand on the still open front door and nervously opened and closed her mouth, unable to utter a sound, let alone words. She was wearing a black Jubilee dress, stockings, high-heeled shoes, and lots of makeup. Well, repeated Frank aggressively. I'm waiting for your bullshit excuse again. Really, I'm just dying to hear why you showed up at this time of night with messed up makeup, wearing that dress. What did you call it? Your magic dress. Frank took a step toward Becky and raised his eyebrows expectantly, his large figure overshadowing her as she trudged toward the door. Becky gasped in fear, looking around restlessly, desperately trying to avoid Frank's intense and aggressive gaze. To Frank, she had never seemed so small, so vulnerable, and so insidious. Seriously, Becky, I'm waiting. I want to know. He took a deep breath. Who were you with tonight, huh? Honestly, that's all I need to know, because I have a very, very good idea of what you were doing. Becky finally closed the door and took a half step toward Frank, shaking her head convulsively. No, no, Frank. It's not what you think it is. It's not. Frank laughed bitterly. Spare me the cliches, please. It can't be anything other than what I think it is, Becky. It can't. So just tell me, who the hell were you with? That's all I want to know. Frank, no. It's not. I can't tell you. Frank crossed his arms and stared at Becky, taking long, deep, angry breaths through flared nostrils. I've had enough of this, Becky. I'm not an idiot or a wuss. You act weird and guilty all the time and can barely tolerate my touch. And this. He reached into his pocket and pulled out several sheets of ruled stationery, pink in color, badly creased and scribbled. Becky flinched. What? Where did you find? I found this confession at the bottom of a trash can yesterday. I have to say, it cleared up a lot of things for me. I agree that the only way to save our marriage would be to end your affair. No, that's not true. But it's too late now, Becky. It's too damn late. Because I've had enough. You know what? I don't care who it is anymore. I'm done. We're done. Finished speaking, Frank ran a hand across his throat and picked up a large suitcase and headed for the door. Becky tried to grab him, but he pushed her away as roughly as he could without hurting her. A few seconds later, he was already pulling the car out of the driveway and heading as fast as he could toward the nearest liquor store. So, Jolene said, catching Bobby's eye as he scrutinized the waiter who was filling glasses with water. You must have some interesting stories about Frank from his time in high school. Maybe something that Frank didn't want to tell us. Bobby laughed and leaned back in his chair, looking up at the ceiling thoughtfully. You know, I think I've got a couple of those stories just about right. He lowered his eyes and smiled understandingly, pointing to Frank with his right hand. And if Frank's fidgeting there, it's because he knows I know where the bodies are buried, so to speak. Yeah, I think I might be the only guy in this room who can poke a hole in the shroud of perfection that everyone at Prairie and Netzall thinks he's always worn. Bobby threw Frank a mischievous look. You think so, Frank? Come on, Bobby, be nice, Frank warned, shaking his head in disapproval. Oh, Frank. You know I would never embarrass you? No way. Let's hear something good, demanded Jolene, giggling. Well, there was the time he almost burned down the school equipment shed when he modified a model rocket with fireworks. Oh, I've heard that story, at least Frank's version, said Jolene, looking at Frank reproachfully. Okay, then he was telling you about that famous night when he was trapped alone in the basement. Bobby's voice was suddenly cut short as he looked at Frank and noticed that his smile had become forced, and there was an expression of apprehension in his eyes. Jolene, however, didn't notice the awkwardness and pitched forward. No, I haven't heard of any lonely nights in the basement, Jolene said with a laugh. But now you've awakened my curiosity. Let's hear it. Isn't really such a great story. Let us judge it for ourselves, Bobby, offered Jolene with a sly grin. I think I'd like to hear the story about the basement, and Paul and Angie probably would too. Bobby looked with slight nervousness at Frank, who shrugged, obviously giving in to Jolene's desire to hear the story. Bobby started again, smiling a little more confidently, but still telling the story with some hesitation. Well, okay. Frank was a senior in high school, and he had a girlfriend who was a little younger, a sophomore or something. And so, one night it turned out that her parents were supposed to be out of town, I think at a bowling alley, and she invited Frank over to her place to, Oh, I think I can guess what she was interested in, said Jolene, watching Frank's cheeks and ears pinken. Frank seems to remember the story, she added with some amusement at his discomfort. Bobby smiled weakly and continued. Well, anyway, the girl's siblings were home watching TV or something, and she and Frank went down to the basement where there's a partially renovated rec room with a couch. Bobby paused and sipped a little before continuing. From what I understand, they were spending some, shall we say, quality time together on the couch when suddenly they heard the garage door open and her parents were home. Bobby's audience was now listening eagerly, laughing and quietly commenting when Bobby's description of that night made Frank wince. Feeling that they appreciated the story, Bobby continued with even more enthusiasm, speaking faster and more energetically. Turns out her parents are very, very strict. Super conservative to the point where they could shoot Frank in the ass if he was caught alone with her. So, she broke some important family rules by inviting him over when his parents weren't home, right, Frank? Frank chewed his lip concernedly as he listened to Bobby and nodded in response. Oh, yeah. Serious infractions. Okay. So she asked Frank to stay downstairs and she ran upstairs to see what happened. Turns out her dad hurt his ankle or knee or something, so her family came home early and he came into the house limping and sat down in a chair that's right next to the only way out of the basement. There's no way to get past it, so Frank is totally trapped until Daddy leaves. And Daddy won't leave for a while because he decides to spend the whole damn night in the chair since he doesn't want to go upstairs with a sore leg. Bobby stopped giggling, his infectious laughter spreading to his listeners. He wiped his watery eyes and began again, clearly enjoying the denouement of the story. Long story short, Frank's stuck. His, girlfriend calls me. I get to the house and talk to Frank through one of the basement windows. There's no way out unless you break the window, and Frank starts to panic because there's no bathroom, and he starts to feel the call of nature. So I have no idea what to do, but the girl, well, she gets on the phone and calls a bunch of friends and says they need to come immediately, and her voice is so panicked that 4 of them show up right away. Anyway, she leads us all into the house and announces to Daddy that we've come to see her. School project, which she says is in the basement. So we all go downstairs and chat there for a few minutes, and then we just head back up the stairs. Only when we get up there, it's no longer 6 of us, but 7, because Frank is with us too, and her dad doesn't notice that there's an extra guy here. He even waves at Frankie, asks how he's doing, and says he'll be watching the Wildcats in the fall. Bobby paused for a laugh. The only catch was that Dad started mentioning that he wanted to see her school project the next day, so we all got together and in an hour or so made a paper copy of Everest or something. Mount Vesuvius, Mr. Geography, said Frank with a smile. Yes, that's right. Mount Vesuvius. Damn, I love that story. Bobby laughed, taking another sip of beer. I'll never forget her as long as I live. Did you forget about B-ball? The sound of the text woke Frank, and he found himself more or less fully dressed, with his shirt, pants, and one shoe half unbuttoned, lying on top of the haphazard mass of crumpled sheets and clothes spilling out of his suitcase. His bladder was painfully full, his mouth was dry, and his head was splitting with the noise of street traffic coming through the door. There was a quarter-full bottle of scotch and an empty glass on the bedside table, along with his resentful cell phone. He sat up abruptly, grabbed the phone, and fell back onto the bed, hitting his head painfully on the pillow. The cell phone helped him get his bearings. It was 10 o'clock in the morning, a Saturday. He had 17 missed calls and messages, and all but one were blocked messages from Becky. It was Paul's message that had interrupted his sleep. Squinting painfully in an attempt to focus on the blurry cell phone console, Frank let out a groan and sent a text back with shaky fingers. Unable to play. Canceling. He went to the bathroom to relieve himself and get a drink of water, and by the time he returned, he had received another message from Paul. What? Where are you? Frank replied to the message. Things are bad at home. At the Holiday Inn in Schaumburg. Don't tell Becky. I'll come to you. No, SOC. Coming now. 40 minutes and a short nap later, Paul was pounding on the door, making a noise that echoed painfully in Frank's head, making him groan and swear. Staggering to the door, he walked over to it and opened it silently to let Paul in, who looked around the room with a mixture of disgust, surprise, and mild amusement as Frank hesitantly returned to the bed. Frank, what the hell? I called your house this morning, Becky answered, but I didn't understand anything she said. She was hysterical. She said something about you leaving her. Frank sat down on the bed, put his head on his hands, and stared dazedly at his feet, one shoe on, the other off. I threw it. You did what? Dumped her. Frank continued to stare at his feet, and Paul waited for him to continue, but Frank made no attempt to add to what he had said, and the only sound was the noise of the heater and movement outside. Is that it? You're not going to give me anything else? More what? Like an explanation as to why you left your wife all of a sudden? Did you have a fight or something? Or something like that. Damn, I feel like I'm conducting a police interrogation with an uncooperative witness. Come on, Frank. What the hell is going on? Frank sat up and stared, unfocused, in the general direction of the half-open curtain and window. Finally, in a sad, robotic voice, he said, "She had an affair, Paul. She's been cheating on me for a long time." What, Becky? Really? Really? Are you sure? Yes. Do you want to tell me about it? No. Frank, let me rephrase that. You're going to tell me about it right now. Frank inhaled deeply and exhaled slowly, looking with some detached irritation at his friend, who was now sitting at the desk, turned to face the bed. Okay, fine. Let me think for a minute. Frank chewed on his upper lip, absent-mindedly examining the empty beer can on the floor, then looked up again. Remember when I told you how weird Becky's acting? Acts guilty all the time. Hides things. Was really bitchy. Like, at the Christmas party? Okay, so far it's like every girl I've ever had on one day or another. Funny, Paul. Frank threw him a look that showed he wasn't in the mood for humor. Anyway, it was a huge change for Becky, and well, remember when I told you I felt like I'd been cut off? What, last fall with the blue balloons? Yeah, it didn't end then. In fact, it never stopped. She just, I don't know, I thought she'd completely lost interest. We've only been together maybe a couple times in the last few months. She's never in the mood, and when doing this, she's like a dead fish or something. I mean, sometimes she starts off like a tiger, but she can never keep going. It's like it cost her a lot of effort to keep any interest at all. What? Do you think she wanted to be with another guy or something? I asked her what it was about, but she was very evasive. Didn't want to talk about it at all. Weird, though. Damn it, Paul. Don't tell me your girlfriends do the same thing to you, because what I'm describing was too weird, too different. There was clearly something going on with her, and I couldn't figure out what it was. Plus, she'd basically admitted to cheating, admitted it in writing. Paul looked stunned. What, she wrote you a letter or something? No, not really. It's hard to explain, really. Frank chewed his lip before continuing. Look, I don't know if you know this or not, but Becky has a tendency to write something when she's stressed, writing it over and over again, a sort of perseveration. Huh? Look, it's hard to describe, but here's an example. When she played softball in high school and she was always hitting high pitches, I found 8 or 9 pages in one of her notebooks that said, "I won't hit high pitches," over and over again. Or a couple years ago, when she thought she was getting a little heavy, I caught her writing, "I will run every day," on several pieces of paper. She was very embarrassed, but I didn't think it was anything special, maybe even cute in a quirky sort of way. Okay, so? Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out sheets of crumpled pink paper, waving them in front of Paul. I found them by accident, a couple days ago, in a trash can. He held the papers out to Paul. Look what she wrote. Paul took the papers from Frank and spread them out on the table, turning on the desk lamp to get a better look. On all the sheets, at different angles, in different sized letters and fonts, was written the same sentence, over and over again. I will lose my marriage if I don't stop this. Stop what? Asked Paul to Frank. Well, to be honest, at first I thought she was talking about her behavior or something. You know, I'm going to lose my marriage if I don't stop being a bitch. But look at the other pages. Paul shuffled through the papers, and Frank jabbed a finger at them when Paul reached the right pages. He stared at the inscription for a moment, and then in a slightly detached and puzzled voice he read aloud. I'm going to lose my marriage if I don't stop this. Affair. He turned to Frank with a stunned expression on his face. Damn it, Frank. Did she say what it was about? Who she was having an affair with? Frank made a sour expression on his face. Hell, I don't know, but it ended last night. I was supposed to be working on a new project, but I got home early when the servers went down and just let the NetSol people do the work to get things up and running. I told her I'd be working very late, maybe all night, so she figured she could peek at me without being caught. She didn't get home until almost midnight. Frank paused for a moment to gather his thoughts, rubbed his face nervously, and took a deep breath before continuing. And it wasn't the first time. She actually did something like that a couple times, coming home late from some fake event or project, but it was just ridiculous. He took another deep breath before continuing. So, when she got home, she was all dressed up, wearing a dress and lots of makeup, clearly fresh from a date. I thought I'd just silently walk past her and leave when she got home, but the sight of her just threw me off balance, and I flat out refused her. I mean, I pressed her really hard to come clean, to tell me who she was seeing. And? The usual. She pretty much refused to answer. Wouldn't tell me who she was with, what she was doing, and all that. I got so pissed off I just jumped out of there. Drove off, got drunk, and here I am. Paul sat down next to Frank, who sat hunched over, face down, resting his elbows on his knees and folding his hands on the back of his head. He patted Frank on the back a couple times. "Look, buddy, what are you going to do now?" mumbled Frank in response. Now I'm moving on. Now I'm going to amputate the gangrenous limb and try to remake my life. He sat up and looked directly at Paul. I'm done with her. In every way. Forever. Paul nodded his head in understanding. Good, buddy. Good. You seem a little distracted from your thoughts. Jolene tilted her head and looked at Frank with amusement and curiosity. Frank turned around and smiled. A forkful of chicken was hanging a few inches above his plate. I think this chicken isn't tasty. Everyone at the table laughed a little. Well, I think Angie and I should run up to the dessert bar, announced Paul, pushing back his chair and helping Angie to her feet. Anyone else? The other three silently declined, and Paul led Angie away from the table. A moment after they left, Jolene reached into her chair and grabbed her purse, then stood up and briefly ironed her dress. I need to go to the girls' room quickly. I'll be back in a minute. She exchanged a smile with Frank and turned to leave, her hourglass shape changing smoothly as she walked away. Bobby pulled his chair closer and leaned into it. There are a lot of moving parts here, Frank. Very high-quality parts. Frank smiled and shook his head. Well, Bobby, I think I'd be surprised if it somehow escaped your attention. Bobby nodded in agreement with a laugh, and then became somewhat thoughtful. He pulled himself even closer to Frank. Hey, listen, Frank. I'm sorry about that story. It's okay, Bobby. It's a funny story. Yeah, it is. He stopped and took a sip of beer, swirled it absent-mindedly in his mouth for a few moments, then swallowed and continued apologizing. Look, it's none of my business, of course, but I heard about you and Becky, and I just wasn't sure you wanted me to bring up the story with her, especially around that Jolene girl. So I'm sorry. Sometimes I get my head so far up my ass that... It's okay, really. Honestly, I don't think anyone guessed that Becky was the girl in the story, and even if they did, it's no secret that we had a pretty long relationship. Yeah, okay. Bobby smiled and looked directly at Frank. Then his expression darkened, his forehead furrowed, and the smile disappeared completely. Frank, again, it's none of my business, but I've always thought you and Becky, friends. And I guess I'd just like to know that. What the hell happened? Frank pressed his lips together into a tight, awkward grimace, mulling over Bobby's question. I'm sorry, Frank. It's not my... Look, Bobby, I don't want to get into the details today, but Becky, she cheated on me. Frank paused, expecting Bobby to express surprise, but his face remained neutral, his mouth and eyes didn't move. He just nodded and listened, waiting for the next statement. And I tried to get her to talk about it for a while, but she didn't want to talk. In the end, I just had to leave. I didn't have a choice, really. Bobby pursed his lips thoughtfully and looked down at the table, tapping his fingers, pondering. Frank, he hesitantly began, looking at his friend again. Look, it sounds like you were tried to get her to talk before you left. But have you talked to her since then? Maybe now she'll talk. Frank's face darkened and his tone became tense, jerky, with a bitter note. Why, Bobby? Why should I talk to her now? What will it change at this point? She ended the marriage. That's her problem. Why should I listen to her stories? Well, for crying out loud, Frank. You were married for over 7 years. At one time, you were a great couple, great from the start. Everyone knew you were getting married. You must have racked up 100,000 miles on your car, driving from the Northwest every damn weekend while she was still in school. And then you moved to Chicago as soon as she could, and... And what? Asked Frank, almost accusingly. Yes, we were very close and devoted to each other for a long, long time. Or at least I was devoted to her. At the end of the day, in the end, it's just a bigger punch in the gut, a more painful betrayal. Bobby shrugged, obviously agreeing with that. And yet, Frank, don't you think... I mean, all this time and effort, and don't you think you should get some kind of closure or something? Frank snorted derisively. Closure? That sounds like some newfangled shit, Bobby. I've moved on with my life. I'm doing fine. I don't need anything more from her. Maybe she could use it. Maybe for her. Bobby said this with some hesitation, nervously lowering his gaze to the table. Frank studied Bobby for a few moments and then shifted in his seat, moving a little closer to him. What's the matter, Bobby? What's going on? Bobby raised his head, but didn't meet Frank's gaze, instead staring at a point just beyond his right shoulder. Frank, listen. Me. Bobby was the easiest conversationalist Frank had ever known, and his difficulty in saying the words was odd. So odd that it occurred to him that Bobby was up to something he wouldn't like, something to do with Becky. Has Becky been talking to you, Bobby? Did she confront you about something? There was an insistent, demanding tone in Frank's voice, and Bobby looked directly at Frank in response, meeting his gaze with determination. Frank, look, this is going to make you angry, but I felt it was the right thing to do. Bobby licked his lips and rubbed the back of his neck nervously, briefly breaking eye contact with Frank and then re-establishing it. Frank waited with a stern, expectant expression on his face. Here's the thing, Frank. I didn't come here alone today. Again a pause, but this time Bobby kept his eyes on Frank. I came with Becky. She's sitting at one of the far tables. Frank's face flushed, his nostrils flared, and his jaw muscles began to clench his teeth hard, making a barely audible grinding sound. What the hell? Did you do that for Bobby? Are you trying to make some kind of scene? What were you thinking? Frank, listen. Bringing that bitch here tonight? They were silent for a moment, both breathing as if they had just run the distance. Frank, I talked to her. A little on the phone last week. She didn't tell me what she did, and I didn't ask. She just said she messed up and that you left her. All she wanted was to talk to you. All she wanted was a few minutes. She says she tried everything. Phone, emails, texts, letters. She says she can't get near you unless you run away. Come on, Frank. As bad as she's done, don't you think she deserves a few minutes to absolve herself of responsibility? Even if it's just an apology? What's wrong with that? Bobby spread his arms to his sides and tilted his head slightly in a pleading gesture as he asked the last question. Frank's face, or maybe his whole body, suddenly became hard and unyielding. He leaned forward, close to Bobby, and spoke to him, hissing through clenched teeth. I'll tell you what can be wrong with that. She betrayed me. She stabbed me in the back after I gave her a dozen faithful years. I've turned down so many women for her. Bobby, you have no idea how many. And at the first opportunity Frank stopped and began taking deep breaths to keep his composure. At the first opportunity, she sells our marriage. Bobby took in Frank's words and nodded almost imperceptibly. Even so, Frank, even so. Frank suddenly lost control of himself, interrupting him with an almost scream. I'm not talking to her, Bobby. Not here, not now, not ever. Several people at neighboring tables broke away from their conversations because of Frank's outburst, looking around with curiosity and concern. and Bobby was so stunned that he put his hands up in a calming motion and slowly stood up. I get it, Frank. I got it. Okay. He stepped away from the table a few feet. Now I'm going to get out of your hair. I don't want to cause any trouble. He turned to leave and saw Jolene, who on her way out of the restroom, cut into a conversation with several male co-workers. Bobby watched her for a second. Her beauty attracted the men to her, the way the sun attracts planets to it, making them spin, with the planets having no will of their own, but obeying the sun's command. Bobby turned to Frank again and gestured at her. Frank, are you sure you're not avoiding Becky because you don't want to risk what you have with Jolene? I guess I wouldn't want to talk to my ex either if it was on the line. Frank squinted angrily and hissed. Screw you, Bobby! Screw you! That's not what this is about. It's not about that. Bobby nodded. No, probably not. Probably not. I'm sorry, Frank. Forget what I said. He gestured at Jolene, who had gotten free and was now making her way to their table. Tell her I'm sorry I had to leave without saying goodbye, but it was nice to meet her. She's a nice girl, really. See you around, Frank. Frank hummed in response, and Bobby backed away from the table, smiled and waved at Jolene, then quickly left. Hey, kid, we gotta go! What are you doing? Paul was dragging a trunk full of Frank's clothes down the hall when he noticed him on the couch leafing through a photo album. Yeah, sorry. I guess I just wanted to take one last look at... Frank choked slightly on his last words and didn't finish. Paul came up behind him and peered over his shoulder. Wedding pictures? Yeah. I guess I'm just... revisiting. I thought it was a pretty good marriage. Maybe a great marriage. Hell, barring college, we've been inseparable for almost 12 years. Just last summer we were ready to start a family, and then it all fell apart. It's still hard to believe, really. Everything we did together, I mean. Paul looked at the photograph. Becky was in her wedding dress and looking at Frank with absolute adoration as he waved to well-wishers on the church steps. He shook his head slightly in bewilderment. Yes, it's hard to understand how people change so much, but it happens, doesn't it? Remember I told you about my Uncle Mark? He seemed perfectly happy. Great marriage to my aunt, or so everyone thought. And then, out of the blue, he goes off with some hooker he met at a convention in Baltimore. Almost without warning. My aunt still can't recover, and she had some very bad years. Paul fell silent and patted Frank's shoulder in consolation. My advice? Move on. Let it go. My aunt let it eat her up. You don't have to. You have plenty of options. Frank shrugged. Honestly, Paul, I'm really doing well. I'm not really in pain right now. I'm just kind of numb from it all, I guess. And I'm not having a hard time moving on with my life. Hell, Jolene and I see each other so often that we don't have time to be angry, and there's no chance of getting lonely. Frank smiled absently. Paul shrugged and laughed. Normally, I'd advise you to be careful in relationships, but Jolene... Well, I don't mean to be rude, but she's too beautiful to be considered a rebound under any circumstances. Frank closed the wedding album and cracked a smile. Yeah, I guess I was lucky after all. Very lucky to have met her. Seriously, my biggest problem isn't loneliness or bitterness or regret. It's trying to keep my pants zipped until the divorce is final. Paul looked slightly surprised. You're waiting for a divorce? How so? Frank folded his hands on the back of his head and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling for a while before returning his gaze to Paul. Looks kind of weird, doesn't it? I mean, she's... A walking wet dream? Suggested Paul when Frank paused. Frank laughed. I guess I was going to use a more romanticized term. But yeah, she's everything a guy needs, not just physically, but in the way she acts. She's the whole package. He bit his lip in thought for a second. And she really likes me. I mean, she's done some, suggestions that we should get a little closer, and I'm pretty damn sure I wouldn't say no if I insisted. But I think I want to be able to look myself in the mirror and know that I haven't done anything wrong. That I didn't cheat or break my vows, even though I know most guys wouldn't blame me for getting her into bed. I just want to have a clear conscience, you know? Paul shrugged and smiled. Okay, that makes sense. But, Frank, if it was me, I don't think I'd worry so much about a clear conscience. He winked at Frank, then checked his watch. Oh man, seriously, we have to load the rest of our stuff into the truck. It's almost 3:30 and you said Becky gets out at 4:30. If we want to avoid her... Yeah, I definitely want to avoid her, said Frank, standing up. I really don't want to listen to her bullshit. She keeps feeding you bullshit? I still haven't talked to her since I left. No conversation at all? No. She had plenty of chances to talk before I left, but she didn't want to, and now, frankly, I just don't want to listen to her. She can't say anything that would make me change my mind, and I don't feel any obligation to try to make her feel better. Like you advised, I'm going to move on and make a clean break, and anything she says isn't going to help with that. Jolene returned to the table and carefully, gracefully settled into the seat next to Frank, smiling all the while. Where did Bobby go? Ah, he must have had some pressing business to attend to. There was an awkward, pre-threatening pause, and Frank decided to change the subject abruptly. Hey, Paul and Angie are still in line at the dessert bar. Do you want to grab something now? No thanks, I'm fine. I'm already full. Silence hung again, and Jolene tried to make conversation, to talk about the project, about the people she'd just met, about the jewelry, but Frank stayed out of it, answering one-word answers or just nodding his head in response to her questions or statements. Frank, you seem preoccupied or distracted or something. Is something wrong? Frank cleared his throat and leaned back in his chair. Nothing much, but it turns out Becky's here and... Jolene leaned back sharply, her face suddenly looking like she'd eaten something incredibly bitter, her eyes almost closed, and her lips pressed together into an unpleasant pucker as Frank continued. Well, I just don't want to make a scene. Like at a Christmas party? Interjected Jolene, her face relaxing a little. Yeah. Jolene took a deep breath, smiled, and stroked Frank's arm. Well, I'm a little surprised she's here, but honestly, come to think of it, I'm not really worried, babe. I'm sure she won't make a scene again. Last Christmas. I think she was just trying to make you jealous. Frank snorted. I think she was just trying to pick up some guy. She had no reason to make me jealous. I'm her husband, for crying out loud. Jolene shook her head, an understanding smile appearing on her face, the kind of smile a mother has when her child displays innocent ignorance of the way the world works. Frank, I think she had plenty of reason to be jealous, at least in her mind. Frank furrowed his brow in puzzlement. What are you talking about? I never gave her a reason to... Jolene laughed involuntarily, quickly covering her mouth to smooth out her reaction in some way. Oh, Frank. Oh, come on. We've both have been on our best behavior. But really, you and I have been very close for a long time now, and we haven't exactly been hiding it. What are you talking about? Before I dumped Becky, before she cheated on me, we never let anyone know we were in a relationship. Jolene tilted her head and took Frank's statement with a slightly amused and incredulous look. Remember the Netsall picnic last summer, Frank? What did you think of it? Why? We spent some time together and... Frank, we spent 2 hours in the canoe together, and quite a bit of time after that. At least 4 different women asked about my new boyfriend and wondered how serious it was. A surprised and slightly puzzled expression appeared on Frank's face. Well, maybe... But we just... Frank brought his hand up to his forehead and rubbed it slowly. Even though, maybe we spent too much time in that canoe. It was months before the Christmas party, and she never said anything, and I never gave her any other reason to think that... Oh, Frank, are you sure? You never talked about me too much or smiled too often at the mention of my name? She leaned forward and spoke more quietly, almost conspiratorially. You never called my name when you were together? No, I never... Jolene shook her head. Ah, Frank, frankly, you just don't understand anything about this. Yes, Frank, yes, you do. You've been doing it all along. No, I didn't, I, wait, how do you know? Frank faltered, unable to find the words to ask a full-fledged question. I know because, Jolene sighed, blowing air out of her mouth in a slow, controlled exhale. Look, Frank, she told me. She told me that almost every time you ended up in bed, you said my name. It was hard for her. Frank's mouth and eyes opened in surprise, and he started to say something, but Jolene stopped him with a raised hand. Look, she made me promise not to tell you that she talked to me. Honestly, she was so upset, and I felt so sorry for her that I made that promise and swore to myself that I would try to distance myself from you, that I would try to do the right thing. But when I found out that she cheated on you, that she left your marriage, I didn't think I should stay away at all. If that stupid bitch is willing to make a move on her own, I see no reason to stay away from the man I want. And I guess I don't see any reason why I should keep my promise not to tell you about that night either. That night? What night? Did she call? What? No, she came in person, to my apartment. I was working, and when I got home, she was waiting for me in front of the door. She must have been there for a few hours because I got home pretty late. Apparently, she had come to see me a couple times before, but got scared and left before I got there. But that night she said she intended to meet me face to face because she thought we'd be together. Jolene paused to take a sip of wine, and Frank slowly shook his head with a dazed and confused expression on his face. So, yeah, she was sure we were having an affair, and decided her best chance was to show up and compete for you. Not literally, of course. But, compete like women do. She waited for Frank to respond, to show that he understood her words, but all he could do was nod weakly. Jolene sighed and continued. She was wearing a beautiful black dress and pearls, and she'd obviously put a lot of time into her hair and makeup. Maybe a little too much makeup. But still she looked... What kind of night was it? Frank's voice was becoming dull and robotic. What night? It was when the server went down, remember? We thought we were going to have to work late and... Frank could no longer hear what Jolene was saying. His mind was working frantically on new facts that were rapidly bringing a new truth to his consciousness. And from that, the old truth was receding, becoming instead an ugly mistake, an expanding, festering wound on his conscience. Thoughts took the form of distinctly visible images, with perfectly memorized sound memories superimposed over them, flashing through his head at breakneck speed. The image of Becky guiltily averting her eyes when he spoke of trust, Jolene's voice. We spent 2 hours together in the canoe and quite a bit of time after that. At least 4 different women asked about my new boyfriend. A strange beginning to Becky's disinterested avoidance of sex, and when they did engage in it, memories of the sudden loss of interest and passion, of her pulling away from him, pouting, angry and cold. And all this while I hear, she told me that almost every time you found yourself in bed, you said my name. The rage he felt when she came home late, wearing a black dress that should have been reserved for special occasions, but she wore it for her lover. And she thought her best chance was to come and fight for you. She was wearing this beautiful black dress and pearls. His sense of angry disappointment and bewilderment when she refused to say where and with whom she was, and heard his own voice explaining why. If I hear that you were talking to her or yelling at her, if she tells me she got a nasty phone call from you, or a snide remark at an event or anything at all that upset her, I'm going to freak out. The stunning, stunning confirmation of his suspicions when he found the notes that read, I will lose my marriage if I don't end this affair, newly conceptualized in a different light. That night she said she was determined to push me into him, to push him and me into her, because she thought we would be together. She was sure we were having an affair. And then more sounds, more memories, taken at random and jumbled from the distant and recent past, invading his scarred mind and mercilessly cutting it wider and wider. Do you, Francis Angelo Portis, take Rebecca Ann Smithson to be your lawfully wedded wife? You know I love you, don't you, Frank? That you're the only man for me? To have and to own you from this day forward, for better or worse. But it's too late now, Becky. It's too damn late. Because I'm done. You know what? I don't care who it is anymore. I'm done. We're done. Richer, poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish. I said, are you sure you're not avoiding Becky because you don't want to risk what you have with Jolene? Until death do you part, according to God's holy law? Listen, I want to be able to look at myself in the mirror and know that I haven't done anything wrong. And suddenly, he heard his name again, sounding like a distant echo, bringing him back to the gala, to the food, the booze, and Jolene. Frank. Frank. What's wrong with you, Frank? You've completely blacked out. Frank looked into the incomparably beautiful face, the clear alabaster skin, the abundant blonde hair falling in thick locks to her shoulders, the white teeth and sensual full lips, and saw the truth. Saw that he wanted her perfect face and her perfect body, and he wanted it so badly that he would sacrifice his marriage to the only woman he loved, if only he could find a way not to torment his conscience. And he had. Oh God, Jolene, oh God. This was a bad idea, Bobby. Becky sat at a table with Bobby and another couple she had studiously avoided talking to all evening, while she tried again and again to get a glimpse of Frank sitting with Jolene at a table near the entrance. She saw them talking in the middle of an emotional exchange when he looked up and saw her looking at him across the crowded room. He turned to Jolene and continued the animated conversation, gesturing once, twice, a third time in her direction, and then stood up, looked in her direction, and started to walk away. He's mad, and he's going to ask me to leave. It's going to be awful. He thinks I'm going to make a scene, like in... Maybe, Bobby interrupted. But at least you'll have a chance to diffuse the situation. You wanted it yourself. Now it's your show. Bobby stepped back, away from Becky, effectively leaving her alone as Frank approached. Frank walked slowly, hesitantly, cautiously making his way through the tables. But he walked with purpose, and there was a sense of drama in his demeanor that first caught the attention of the man at the podium who was preparing to make a few announcements. His gaze settled on Frank, and one by one, table by table, their attention shifted to Frank as he moved forward toward Becky. With each step, the collective consciousness of the room focused more and more on him. Conversations broke out one by one, and with each step the room grew quieter. Strangely quiet. Quiet, like a church. And then he stopped, swaying slightly and breathing heavily, and stood silently in front of the seated Becky. She was sitting perfectly straight with her hands folded politely in her lap, her soft hair was loose, and she was wearing a beautiful white dress, simple, modest, and clean, a dress that was perhaps more suitable for a wedding than a party. For a few moments no one spoke, but Becky made several failed attempts, her mouth opening and closing half a dozen times. Finally, with a visible effort, she broke the silence. Frank, I didn't cheat on you. She said it simply, in a breaking voice. I just wanted you to know that I wouldn't cheat on you. He only nodded slowly, but when he didn't say anything back, she continued. I know I can't compete with her, and it's going to be very hard for me without you. But at least I wanted you to know that I'm faithful. I don't think I could move on with my life if you left thinking that I cheated on you, that I betrayed you. I'm not sure I could live without you, but I know I couldn't live with the thought of you hating me. Please, Frank. Please believe me. Their eyes locked for a few moments, and Frank began to shake quietly, still unable to speak, his eyes becoming glassy and then moist. Finally, he took one tentative step towards Becky and let out a quiet sigh that was repeated by the watchers as he knelt abruptly as if in front of an altar, took her hands in his and said nothing, continuing to stare into her eyes. Becky's eyes reflected shock and then uncertainty. She gingerly pulled her right hand away and, in an uncertain movement, gently brought it up to Frank's face, feeling a tear trickle down her thumb. Frank? Becky, I'm so sorry, Becky. I love you, Becky, and I'm really, really sorry. Becky absorbed the words of her kneeling husband, the sadness in his voice, the look on his face, and the gentle touch of his hands, and, with a sudden epiphany, realized that a miracle had happened. that her husband not only believed her, but still loved her. He had come back to her. She burst into tears. "If you want, I can take you home." Bobby walked over to Jolene, who was sitting with tears in her eyes, watching what everyone else in the room was seeing. After kneeling in front of Becky for a few minutes, Frank stood up, lifted her into his arms, hugged her, and kissed her like a groom kisses his bride. Then, without breaking eye contact, he took her hand and led her toward the exit. Oh God, I really, really wanted him. I had no idea that this was going to happen. I thought maybe I don't know. Jolene's voice trailed off as she spoke. Bobby threw her a sympathetic look, but also tried to suppress a smirk. You know, I think things will work out well for you. You'll always have plenty of options. Yeah, maybe. She glanced glumly toward the exit as Frank and Becky finally left the room. Well, let's get you home. He smiled at her as warmly as he could. If anything, Jolene, I think you're the only woman in the world who could turn Frank away from Becky for even a little while. She smiled sadly at Bobby and shrugged. Maybe. But that's not much comfort, is it? She took a deep breath through her nose and let it out in a long, wistful sigh. I guess I just want what she has and what they have. Like everyone else, Bobby said, helping her up. Like everyone else. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.